Hello, and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that we need to talk about. My name is Kieran Kelly, and today we need to talk about anti-Semitism. There is no doubt that at the moment anti-Semitism is on the rise, alarmingly. But at the same time, the significance of the weaponizing of false accusations of anti-Semitism is also on the rise. So the combination of the two makes this an extremely pressing issue, but it also means that we actually have to be quite clear-eyed in our judgments of what is and what is not anti-Semitism. As you'll see as I progress, it can be rather difficult because there is a tradition of coded anti-Semitism that tries to convey anti-Semitic messages in a deniable manner. So this, unfortunately, leads to people being oversensitive to what they think is hidden messages and so forth. So it can create a lot of confusion. So I will try and unpack that a little bit here. Now, at the moment, the rise of anti-Semitism is seems to be accelerating beyond what I would have predicted earlier. I have seen over the years many people who have come through Palestine solidarity work sort of seemingly picked off. People who are psychologically vulnerable seem to be sort of sucked away from sanity into some sort of fascist anti-Semitic viewpoint on life, which is paranoid and anti-intellectual. But now it seems to be spreading, and examples, for example, such as an historian going on Tucker Carlson saying that Winston Churchill was the great villain of the biggest villain of World War II. And in response, someone on X posted a poll and who is the greatest villain of World War II? And it went Winston Churchill with 40 something percent, then Stalin with 30 something percent, then Hitler with 20 something percent. And accompanying that were many anti-Semitic comments, usually about how they often, well, sometimes they'll say the Jews, but they mean it whether they say it or not. They have twisted history. They're, making this lovely chap Hitler out to be a bad guy when he really wasn't at all bad. And, I don't say this in any way to defend Winston Churchill. He was a mass murdering fuckwit. I hate the guy. And, I don't have much time for Stalin either. That's not the point. There is a reason why Hitler has been taken as the epitome of evil. Not only did he conduct a genocide that went, in some ways, was very typical of genocide, the Judeocide, but went further than others in that the industrialization, that with the gas chambers and so forth, was a grotesque step further than others have gone. Although, we should always bear in mind that the vast majority of Jews were killed in more traditional genocidal means: starvation, mass executions, and so forth, disease. So, in fact, what happened to them is very much what is happening to people in Gaza right now. These are not the only examples of anti-Semitism that seems to be arising recently. For example, Kim.com posted on X, is it possible that more Christians were killed in Jewish-run gulags than Jews in Nazi concentration camps? Have you ever heard about this? Was history manipulated? Who's using famine for mass murder at present? Whose cruelty is on display every day? And whose is that? I mean, he clearly doesn't mean Israel because, um, you know, there were no Israel didn't exist during the, like the, um, well, they didn't exist during the Holocaust. They didn't exist in the early part of the Soviet Gulag system. Um, yeah. And by the way, Jews did not run the prisons of the Soviet Gulag. Um, uh, so yeah, I mean, this is it's not even dog whistling. It's just basically anti-Semitism couched as asking questions. He links to an absolutely batshit fucking uh, article that, like, like, goes on about Christian martyrs and is like just weird because it doesn't, like, it's all these people who died in the Gulag when 15 million people are supposed to have died in the Gulags. They call them Gulags, even though Gulags was the name of the prison service. It wasn't the name of a prison. Um, the 15 million. They never sent 15 million people to camps or prisons. It's utterly ludicrous. The other thing is, of course, that the survival rate of the Gulag-run prisons was estimated around 95%, which is like there's about the fatality rate of the Nazi-run camps during once World War II had started. So yeah, this is madness, and it's a very loaded form of madness. It's a form of, I guess, suggesting, just asking questions, of course, but suggesting that there is a giant conspiracy of Jews who slaughter people and control history, and it's fucking evil stuff. And that's Kim.com. So those of you who haven't got the message yet that he is a right-wing asshole, I'm telling you now, as a probably, well, to people who paid attention, it's been obvious since the beginning that he was that, but some people, for some reason, thought he was something else, but he's not. Anyway, so what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism? Well, it's hatred of Jews as such. So it's hatred of Jews for being Jews, not hatred of Jews, well, hatred of people who happen to be Jewish. So, say, for example, just a random one, say if I hated Ben Shapiro, um, heaven knows why, but just as a hypothetical, um, I could hate him, and him being a Jew wouldn't make me anti Semitic. I could have other reasons for hating Ben Shapiro. And stranger things have happened. But if I hated him because he was a Jew, that would be anti Semitism. So there, that's in a nutshell, really. But of course, this is something, a profound historical hatred that has grown up through time, through many different institutions and historical events that have built it up into something in the Christian world, in the Western world, that is almost, I mean, it has a well, it is unique. I don't, yeah, and it has a level of extremity at times that can be doesn't have any parallels, and I mean, I guess the comparisons are invidious, and I don't want to make comparisons with the horrors of anti-African racism, or or the anti-Aboriginal racism in Australia. That historically all sorts of horrible things have happened because of that form of hatred, and I'm not trying to downplay that, but this is a peculiar form of hatred, that it has its own rules that, as it turns out, may have, in a way, played a role in the evolution of those other forms of racism in time. So one of the things that is unfortunately quite important with anti-Semitism is this idea of tropes. This idea that tropes that lead to coded ways of talking about Jews, so that you can like say what you mean to say about the evil Jewish conspiracy to dominate the world, without using the term Jews. And this becomes a big problem. So there is a good example of how difficult things can get and how confusing things can get, that can be found in a 2001 documentary by John Ronson, which is part of a series. But this episode is called David Icke, the Lizards and the Jews. And it's about a guy called David Icke who has some exotic theories about life. And the main one, the central one, is that a lot of the most powerful people in the world are, in fact, 9-foot tall, blood drinking, shape shifting reptilians. A lot of people found in this reason to believe that he was making a coded reference to some sort of Jewish conspiracy. However, it's not really particularly defensible to say that. He is very clear that he doesn't think that he's not referring to Jewish people. He's referring to lizards. He makes it very, very, very clear. He might not use the term lizards. I think he might call them reptilians or something like that. But anyway, and John Ronson goes to talk to someone from the Anti-Defamation League, and he says to this woman who works for the Anti-Defamation League, he says to her that Icke would say that he's not against Jews. He just believes, he's not saying that Jews are reptilian. He's saying that their leadership, like the Muslim leadership and the Christian leadership, has been taken over by reptilians. And she, without missing a beat, she just says, oh, well, that is definitely anti-Semitism, because if you accuse the leaders of something, you're basically accusing the whole people of something. Now, she is not even concerned that that he says the same thing about Muslim leaders and Christian leaders. He's named many, many people who he considered to be reptilians, most famously, of course, the royal family of England, who aren't Jewish. And what you come to realize is that people like the Anti-Defamation League aren't looking for answers, they're looking for confirmation. They're trying to hunt out signs of crypto anti-Semites, and they're finding them because they take each instance as a confirmation, not as a piece of evidence to be weighed rationally. And of course, this is quite interesting because it really mirrors David Icke's own thinking on that sort of thing. He's not, he also finds evidence, maybe not very sound evidence, but he finds people who've seen the reptilian signs in people, and he takes it as confirmation. So there's this weird mirroring between the two. But another thing about it, is that they choose to try and persecute him, and of course that just hardens his resolve and backs him into a corner where he digs his heels in. And in the meantime, just to make things even more interesting, confusing, annoying, whatever, neo-Nazis go to his talks and then write up reviews saying, well, he says he's talking about lizard people, but we know what he's really talking about, wink, wink, and approve of him. And they also ignore him when he says, I'm not talking about Jews. So, I think a lot of the people, maybe people both in the both in the Nazi sphere and the anti-Semitism sphere, some of the people may not be actually genuine, and they may not care whether someone is a real anti-Semite. They just want to exploit it for their own interpretation, their own usage. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. Can't even trust the Nazis anymore. Anyway, so the term, to explain the origins of the term anti-Semitic, we need to look at the word Semitic first, which was coined in 1781, and it was named after a son of Noah called Sem, and it was used to refer to the languages Arabic, Amharic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, which obviously we know that Arabic is quite widespread. Amharic is mainly spoken around Ethiopia, but has actually spread quite far as well. And the others tend to be more Levantine oriented. So these are widespread languages between the four of them, and they cover people of very different ethnic backgrounds, people who have different cultures, different religions, um, you know, uh, uh, and look different, like phenotypically different in terms of, say, skin tone or other features. So they really, the idea of creating a racial group out of them is pig ignorant to begin with. However, this did not stop French Orientalist Ernest Renan from calling the Semitic races inferior to European races, and then to which a German Jew, Moritz Steinschneider, criticized him for what he called anti-Semitism, and that was in 1860. So there we have the original concept of anti-Semitism. Now, of course, they're both focused at this stage on Semitic kind of being, for them, linked to the Jews who lived in Europe, Ashkenazim, who are of European descent for the most part, So they, again, this racial idea is kind of getting a bit silly. However, it was only just getting started. Um, the word in European, well, the Europeans used the word, of course. The word Semitic um, became associated mostly with Jews and meaning European Jews. Um, and when it was used to reference other people, it was often used as a way of denigrating European Jews by saying that they were the same as these barbaric foreign people with dark skins and lived in hot countries and all of that inferior stuff. So really, they are taking a prejudice, which, as we'll see, is well established in Christian anti-Semitism, and then fitting it in with the new racialized way of dividing up the world. Well, not that new at this stage, of course, but it was still very, very fashionable at the height of fashion, racism. So, really, in a way, they're taking Orientalist and color coded racism and using that as a way of further denigrating European Jews who um, probably aren't that identifiable by skin color and so forth. Now, Jewish, well, not uh, Zionist and some Jewish people tend to claim that anti-Semitism is um, isn't just something that arose, as we'll see, through Christianity, but rather some sort of defect in non-Jewish people in a way, something that sometimes, of course, they see it almost as a defect in Jews themselves, that they provoke this irrational hatred in others. Now, of course, the history of anti-Semitism in Christendom is so brutal, so horrible that it, obviously there are Jewish people have a very good reason for um, suggesting that they have suffered a lot of persecution. But they also tend to point to ancient Greek and traditional Muslim um, people and accuse them of an anti-Semitic sort of behaviour that is similar to that. Whereas, of course, as I'll explain, what we know as anti-Semitism has a very a very clear historical um, pedigree coming through Christian belief into scientific racism. Um, so the this is often linked to what's called the Lacrimose historiography of Jewish history. So, lacrimose means crying, tearful, um, and in which some people would say that Jewish people exaggerated the degree to which they were persecuted or hated by others, such as the Greeks and indeed the Romans, who they were subjugated by, of course, and who they had. I mean, there's no question there were horrible, bloody revolutions and repression, all that sort of thing that happened. But it is uh, um, like Shlomo Sand, who wrote The Invention of the Jewish People, for example. It really criticizes some of the exaggerated beliefs uh, in Romans, for basically forcing all Jewish people to leave Palestine, which um, is very much under question, but is a traditional historiographical interpretation of events. Um, but in reality, there is a kind of a unique character to Christian anti Semitism, and in some ways, a unique character to Christian violence against people of differing beliefs. So, for example, I mean, we could look at the sects in Islam, the Shia, the various different types of Shia, the Sunni, and so forth, and them living side by side with Jews, Christians, Yazidis, Zoroastrians, and not without violence at times, not at all. But if you compare that to the way the Catholic Church operated in medieval Europe, they did not tolerate anyone who wasn't part of that, and so like the there's various um, there's various times, watershed moments in the degree to which political violence was meted out against people with heterodox views in the Christian world, uh, both before and after the schism between the Eastern and Western churches, based in Rome and Constantinople, respectively. And one person who traces this is an author called James Carroll, a former Catholic priest who wrote a book called Constantine's Sword: The Church and the Jews: A History. And he feels that there was a moment when Constantine adopted Christianity as a state religion, brought it into the Roman system, which was one that, as we know from the persecution of Christians, but also sometimes persecution of Jews too, they could be very cruel to people whose belief systems were against the state religion, whatever part of the religion that the state decided must be obeyed, they would punish those who didn't. So he adopts this religion, and Carroll thinks that he created a transformation, adopting the cross as a symbol, which of course relates to both a spear and a sword. And in doing so, they changed the focus of the crucifixion story from the miracle of resurrection to the miracle of the sacrifice. And he thinks that was quite a bad turn, put it that way. And this began to lead to all sorts of things. So again, obviously, when there was persecution of Jewish people all along, to some extent, but when they first started preaching the Crusades, which were kind of a response to, they'd built a system where you have a kind of transnational religious authority, and this feudal system of kings and lords, and people who could be a king in their own right, but be owe allegiance to another king somewhere else, and so forth. And it is very, it's extremely violent warrior caste system, basically, which was involved endemic, permanent warfare on small scale, bands of people rushing around the place and often killing civilians and so forth. And so this was one of the reasons for preaching the crusade, was to get them focused on a more godly form of slaughter. And even in the First Crusade, there were pogroms from the Rhine to the Danube, and um, and and so it continued through other crusades as well. And then in 1209, they preached a different sort of crusade, the Albigensian Crusade. Now, what had happened was that the northern lords of what's now France had conspired with the church to attack the southern part of what is now France, which was at the time that spoke a different language. It was essentially a different country, although, of course, under feudalism, these things were always a bit confused. But it was Languedoc. They're not not French in the way that they are today, and about 25% of their population were Cathars, who had a different, they're a kind of sect of Christianity, had a very different view of um, of things, and so both the northern French lords wanted the land, the the church wanted to wipe out a heterodox viewpoint, which it was, it is not, it never tolerated that sort of thing for very long. So they went in and committed the most awful genocidal brutality. But what came out of it, apart from the transformation of this of France into France, was the Inquisition. They instituted the Inquisition out of that in order to keep an eye on what everyone believed, and if they don't believe the right thing, then to torture them into confessing and then burn them at the stake, or some things along those lines. Certainly frequent enough to do that. So, and the reasons for burning people at the stake were things like heresy and apostasy. They didn't burn you at the stake for being a Jew as such. But what was happening elsewhere was the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula. So with the expansion of Arab rule that moved out of Arabia across North Africa and then into the Iberian Peninsula, and they took it over. They spread Islamic culture, Arabic language, and so forth into what is now Spain and Portugal. But from the early 8th century onwards, there was Christians reconquering that land, and it was a process that took until 1492 to complete, the same year that they began the conquista of the Americas, of course. The same year that the Americas were discovered, in order to allow them to begin a conquest there as well. Anyway, so what happened was that many Jews were forced to leave. Many of them went into North Africa, but others were taken on by the Ottoman Sultan, and they became the Sephardic Jews, who moved to Greece and Turkey. Others, however, stayed and converted. They weren't allowed to just stay and be Jewish, but they converted. And some of them, either through ignorance or because they didn't really want to give up their own religion and become a different religion, they only converted in formal terms, and their practices, they still practiced Jewish religion. Again, like sometimes this could be just an ignorant thing. They didn't really understand what they were meant to do as Christians. Other times people converted, but it wasn't accepted that they were converted. And the people who said they were Christian but were really Jews or were said to be really Jews were called crypto Jews. Now, one of the things about crypto Jews is if you could prove someone was a crypto Jew, then their property was up for grabs. So there was a material interest to dispossess conversos, the converted Jews, from their um, from their property. So this kind of led people to find even more reason to hate Jews, and they started to remember a passage from the Bible that was that seemed to indicate that you couldn't just stop being a Jew. And this is called the blood curse, and it comes from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 25, which reads, So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves. And all the people answered, His blood be on us and our children. So then this became this sort of theological reason for thinking that being a Jew wasn't actually about being religiously Jewish. It was something that actually passed through the generations. And this is why I said earlier, in a way, this is an important step in the invention of racism as we know it today, because it wasn't it wasn't a something that you could stop being. So, we're so used to color coded racism nowadays that we kind of think of it as natural. But of course, traditionally, this was what is not the way people were racist about each other. So, for example, the Greeks thought of the us and them in terms of language, particularly because they called the them barbarians because their language sounded like ba 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 ba, you know. And so the key indicator of whether you're one of us or one of them was things like language, clothing, and so forth, habits, mores. So this is a more of an ethnic idea of who is us and who is them. And of course, you could have any skin tone you wanted. And we think that that is, it doesn't seem natural to us, but there are remnants of it today. And if you'll see often in Hollywood movies of a certain era, you'll see like people in exotic places surrounded by brown-skinned individuals, and the ones who like wear baseball caps and talk in American accents, they can have the same skin color, but they're reliable. They're the good guys. They probably drink Coca-Cola and hate communism, whatever. And we also see this some elements of this in traditional British class-based entertainment as well, in that like like a lot of British stuff has a lot of embedded messages about class in it. It may surprise people to know that, but it does. And so you might have a traditional scene where the kind of ignorant lower middle class person will be lording it over someone with of African descent, for example, and that person would turn around and speak in an Oxbridge accent, and then like the lesser personage would be shamed by this because they had assumed they were a savage and whatever. And it's like it passed for anti-racism at the time, of course, but it was really a deeply classist thing. And this African person is probably turns out to be a prince or something like that. That outranks, in class terms, outranks the white person, the poor white person, and that made perfect sense to British people in the 50s and 60s. And that is something that runs contrary to our understanding of color coded racism. So, we right. I have got a little bit off track there, but so one of the things with the Inquisition was that it started to look for various signs of heterodoxy, and often this would come to mean demon worship, sorcery, and witchcraft, and increasingly so, in fact, until like maybe I think the mid 15th century. This hysteria about witchcraft was growing, in a book called, or a work, shorter work called Malleus Maleficarum, um, the hammer of the witches, came out, and it really like gendered it a lot, made it about women. But the thing is that it was feeding the same sort of thing, in that it's the same idea of confirmation. You're looking for the signs. It's out there. You're looking for where it is. So they're hunting it out, witchcraft style, witch hunt style, and it doesn't matter whether you're hunting for crypto Jews or anti-Semites or witches. The process is rather similar. So this was part of the way the Inquisition was going, and there is actually a bit of a kind of historical background to that as well, in that like religious leaders normally will tell people that people of different faiths practice. When I say normally, I mean, I'm not saying that they all do this. I'm saying that it's not abnormal for religious leaders to make up stories about practitioners of different faiths. So, for example, from Jewish sources, we have a history that tells us that the Essenes liked to anoint each other with semen, and this anointing, which is obviously important in Christianity as well. Christ meaning the anointed. Um, um, the Jews said that is now in the history books. Probably wrongly, I think, and they ascribed to them other sexual practices, which they knew that their own faithful would find repellent, or if not repellent, then morally suspect. So this is a tradition that goes back. We can look at the way Muslims have talked about Yazidis as well. They have a lot of stories about some obviously fictitious practices. Again, it's that kind of sense of a witch hunt mentality, creating dramatic, shocking narratives, and the shock itself can act to switch off the uh, the cognitive faculties, the skeptic faculties that would make you go, "Hey, wait a second, does that make sense? Do they really rub semen all over each other? I mean, doesn't sound that spiritual." Anyway, so it happened that sometime before the Inquisition was initiated, a boy in Norwich called William of Norwich was killed in 1144 by perpetrators who weren't Jewish, or a perpetrator who wasn't Jewish. I won't get into that. There is a very good book about it called The Murder of William of Norwich by E.M. Rose, which I'd highly recommend you reading. But the thing is that the significance was that 6 years later, a guy called Thomas of Monmouth started telling people it was the Jews that did it. And they dug up the bones and they put them in a shrine, and it was quite a lucrative thing to do in those days. And they created a narrative about a Jewish ritual involving taking the blood from the child and using it in ritual forms. And then, over time, this evolved into mixing the blood with with flour to make unleavened bread, matzah, for Passover, which they referred to as Jewish Easter. So this is sometimes referred to as a canard. This is a type of lie with legs that keeps going and going and going. That seems to be difficult to eradicate. But of course, now what we have is that when people accuse Israel of killing innocent children because they're killing innocent children, some people in response say that it's a blood libel, which I think is absolutely disgusting, all things considered. But, this is the world we live in. So, So this, once that idea was out into the world, it spread. And from the medieval to the early modern period, I think that anti-Semitism started to really embed itself as just a commonplace. And I would actually compare it in some ways to anti-Arab racism as it's been in the last 100 years. I think that, and maybe anti-Islam as well. In that it is this unremarkable thing that you don't need to defend. You don't need to have strong feelings about it. You can remark about Arab treatment of women, for example, or Muslim treatment of women, or or terrorism. Saying, oh yeah, but they were all, they might not be all terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim or whatever. These sorts of things. So this is the sort of level it's at. Now, with the kind of, at the same time though, with the spread of this sort of blood libel type thing, pogroms, of course, are going on all the time. A lot of people view anti-Semitism as almost being a bottom-up form of hatred. It's a common man's form of hatred, and a pogrom is an explosion of pent-up discontent among the masses. And I think a lot of the reason people believe this is that often the monarchs would declare Jews to be under their protection, and monarchs are kind of the political authority people look to when examining history, I mean. And, so they would restrict Jews from being able to do this, that, or the other. They weren't allowed to carry weapons. They couldn't engage in certain trades. They couldn't live in the countryside. They had to live in cities and so forth. But they'd often protect them, like they were like elk or something like that. Say, you're not allowed to kill them. They're my animals, whatever. So, the English king most famously extended protection to all of the Jews as um, his special, you know, um, special little children under his protection. But I think when you actually drill down into the pogroms, now it's not my area of expertise, but just what I've read enough accounts that I see a different pattern, and that is that is really something initiated by authority figures, but just lower down. And sometimes it has actually been happened at the behest of monarchs too, but it tends to be mayors, local potentates, that sort of thing, who uh, have their own political reasons for wanting to whip up further against Jews. They do so, and then frequently what happens is that it gets out of hand, and then they have to uh, act to prevent the orgy of death and destruction that they themselves have unleashed, which is another reason that kind of reinforces this idea that it's something that the masses do and the authorities try to stop. Um, and it's just not. I don't think that's true. Um, so we have um, this happening at this time, and of course the Reformation didn't improve things for Jews. I mean, obviously, uh, um, there is. I mean, certainly the Catholic Church has been very bad in many ways, but Martin Luther, of course, was, although he had written in defense of Jews earlier on in his life, he was very anti Semitic, hatefully so, violently so. So, I think, one of the things as well about this becoming a sort of background noise thing is that um, it becomes like, as we move into the modern era, it's still there. It starts to be conflated with scientific racism. So you've got this matter of fact anti-Semitism and this growing sense of racial uh, division in the world that is arising. And, it becomes very natural for people who uh, might be inclined, maybe they're Jewish themselves, might be inclined to defend Jews against the worst violent anti Semitic things by conceding first that there is something wrong with them, you know? And so basically, like, those who want to oppose anti Semitism have to basically make obeisance to the general knowledge that all Jews are wrong in some way, or there is a problem, or there is a Jewish problem. So, for example, we got a this is quite a lot later. This is from 1936. Zionist, um, Hashuma Hatzer, I think, who said the Jew is a caricature of a normal, natural human being, both physically and spiritually. As an individual in society, he revolts and throws off the harness of social obligations, knows no order nor discipline. This is like pretty racist stuff, obviously, but coming from a Jewish Zionist. And we have many other Jews saying anti Semitic things about the Jew. And this is a point I really want to emphasize here. When, and this is what .com is doing by implication with his anti-Semitic tweet. When you create a monolith out of Jewish people as the Jew, that is anti-Semitism, and it doesn't really doesn't have to be a negative. That you're suggesting something negative about them. It's still anti-Semitic if you say they're all good at like playing violin or whatever. Um, we see these. This sort of racism is not uncommon about, for example, Chinese people. They're all good at maths. It's still racism, Um, and so, we see this and we see, again, this kind of need to start any attempt to defend Jewish people has to start by saying they've got a defect and that they are inferior to begin with. And then we see just kind of casual anti Semitism, including amongst Jewish people, and so not everyone necessarily would have said anti Semitic things at the time, but it was conventional enough. So we have this situation where, it's understood that there's a Jewish problem, so widely understood that most people have a very anti-Semitic take on that, rather than thinking that it's like a problem that society has with its intolerance. For example, as I would hope some people would see it that way today. I'm not sure I have that much faith anymore, but I would hope that at least some would understand that that's the real Jewish problem. Is It comes from intolerance rather than anything else. But I mentioned the anti-Semitism of one of the Zionists there, and of course, I think one of the things that people are focusing on a lot at the moment is Zionist anti-Semitism and the links between anti-Semitic beliefs and Zionism. And there is a kind of, it's not as simple as like all Zionists are anti-Semitic, but rather there is a kind of obvious connection between the two. There is an obvious affinity between the political project of Zionism and having anti-Semitic beliefs, and that isn't, and like maybe even more so for non-Jewish Zionists than for Jewish Zionists. It makes a lot of sense for people who are anti-Semitic to think that Jewish people should go and live somewhere else. And we do see a lot of support historically for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the state of Palestine to come from people who didn't really like Jews. And so, there is definitely a link there. And of course, there are people who uh, bring up with maybe understandable horror some of the instances in which Zionists of various Zionist individuals chose to collaborate with the Nazi regime. And this is obviously, I understand why this is shocking to people. But I think we do need to keep that in perspective as well, the same as we need to keep in perspective any sort of collaboration from the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem or the Iraqi government with Nazi Germany. These things happened, but if you think that those forms of collaboration were shocking, I have some really bad news for you about the French, the Italians, the Japanese, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, And even to a large extent, people in the USA, IBM, the Ford company, lots and lots and lots of people worked with the Nazis, and it was always bad. And most of them were way more significant in their contribution to Nazism than Zionists or the Mufti, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So, yeah, I just I would caution against getting too carried away with, apart from maybe using the collusion between Zionists and Nazis to burst bubbles of untruth that are spread by Zionists. I don't really see it as a particularly um, valid reason for attacking the belief system as such. So yeah, now, um, however, moving past the days of Nazism, I think we do have to deal with the rise of actual Muslim anti-Semitism, and it certainly does exist nowadays. And I mean, I think I'm happy personally to lay it all at the doors of Western imperialism. I mean, it's basically that is the cause, one way or the other, of all of it. So, for example, in Baghdad in the late 19th century, the British, because they're an empire that likes to practice divide and rule, set up connections with the Jewish minority in Baghdad, a very impoverished place at the time, and whose Jews were impoverished. And then within this minority, they created a minority within the minority that were stinking rich, because they chose to preferential treatment in trading with them, which sowed the seeds of resentment that would be fed by later historical events. So the obvious thing that really started the growing anti-Semitism of the Muslim world, in at least the Middle East and North Africa, was the Nakba, and then the 1948 war, in which various Arab armies fought a war against Israel, and this became like a reason for well, obviously people are not always sophisticated in their understanding of politics, so they saw this country calling itself a Jewish country doing bad things, and they thought, well, Jews must be bad. I mean, what's new, eh? Certainly, I think this is what's happening today as well. But to make things worse, Israeli intelligence were deliberately carrying out false flag terror attacks on Jewish people in places like Iraq. This is something Avi Schleim talks about. He's been interviewed recently. I believe he wrote a memoir not long ago, but he fled Baghdad as a youngster after several bomb attacks were carried out against Jews there, and it later turned out that that um, they were carried out by Israeli intelligence. And then, of course, Iraq's later history, well, under Saddam Hussein, use the he would use the threat of Israeli intelligence, who were no doubt operating in his country doing dire and awful things, I'm sure, but he would use them to whip up anti-Jewish fervor, anti-Semitic fervor, and by accusing various innocent Jews of being spies for Israel and disloyal. So, it became a bit of a vicious circle, really. So, it is a real thing, and it is something that will have to be dealt with, obviously. Which can only happen when we actually kind of deal with the things that the sources of the sort of discontent and hatred uh, that are being spread at the moment, which would involve security and better, probably. I mean, I'd even go so far as to say a much better standard of living for all these people who live on top of expensive oil fields and who have natural resources and probably should be far better off than they are today. But anyway, it is. We'll just put put Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism to the side for now. I mean, it's also greatly exaggerated and lied about all the time. You have people constantly mistranslating Iranian um, leaders and deliberately misconstruing what they're saying for political purposes. So you have to take it all with a grain of salt anyway. But one of the key things about the modern anti-Semitism, and we're heading back to the West now, is that it really revolves around conspiracy theories, caricatures, dog whistles, coded information, tropes, a whole bunch of stuff that isn't necessarily just outright saying we hate Jews. And so one of the key texts, of course, was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was published in 1903. It was um, it was a forgery created by the Tsarist political police, the secret police in the Tsarist state of Russia, the Russian Empire. And once again, this is like, they did it. They had their reasons, political reasons, of course, for scapegoating Jewish people. But the most notorious part of the text was the funeral oration given by a rabbi who more or less stood up at a funeral and said, "And this is our plan for taking over the world. We will do this, and second we will do that." And there's no actual logic in the idea of someone standing up and announcing this to a whole room full of people at a funeral. And this is again like this idea that you say something shocking, and instead of people going, what? That doesn't make any sense, they go, you know. So it's switching off the critical faculties again by the very extreme nature of the claims. So and we again this kind of feeds this essentially anti-intellectual sort of um, style of thinking that was very prominent amongst fascists, and I believe is very prominent in um, what is an increasingly fascist online, fascist political population, um, in that they are radicalized in the same sense that fascists were, to be outraged and anti-intellectual, and there are people doing this deliberately because they seek power this way. So, there is a definite There are definite echoes of the past in today, and the online world is making it very easy to link up these wielders of power with um, their brown shirt masses, and they don't have to put on a uniform themselves, identify themselves, or anything like that. They can astroturf their fascism. So it is it is a different form, and they don't need a charismatic leader as such. The people who do the talking and the persuading are further down the chain than that, which some people would claim was true in terms of fascism and Nazism back in the day too. Anyway, one of the tendencies in this, in old or new anti-Semitism, is to the coding and the tropes and stuff. It works with a conflation of Jewishness with other ideas. So there's a bit in that, going back to that John Ronson, the documentary. He talks to one of the anti-New World Order conspiracy theorists. That's what he calls them. I mean, whatever. And that guy says, "Oh yeah, they're always using anti-Semitism accusations to shut us up. We're not talking about the Jews. We're talking about the different people, a global elite who want to dominate us all. We call them globalists." And it's like, well, that was 20 something years ago now. But nowadays, most of the time people use the term globalists, they're probably referring to Jews. Or maybe not most of the time, but you definitely can't rule out someone being anti-Semitic when they talk about globalists. But of course, again, like, instead of looking for it as a confirmation, you should remain open to the possibility, and maybe um, point out that their language could be misinterpreted rather than assuming. Um, it does require more than one piece of evidence to work these things out. So, but the conflation, like traditionally, obviously, we saw that the very idea of Semites is conflating a people who of basically European descent who practice a particular religion with all these people, racially diverse people, to the extent that race is a real thing, ethnically and genetically diverse people from different places, and saying you're all Orientals. And then they conflated them with Freemasons and with Bolshevism, with banking, with Hollywood, with the media, then the New World Order, then the World Economic Forum, neo-Malthusianism, neoliberalism, and so forth. And often these things are, I think maybe things that some of these should be things we ought to be concerned about. Some of these things are literally acting in a conspirational way to shape the world we live in an anti-democratic way. And we really do need to pay heed to that. But it's the conflation with what is essentially a religion, Judaism, with that is the problem. So we, you know, the conflation also works to kind of mean that, like, it creates these fuzzy boundaries which are very useful for a fascist sort of discourse. So, um, yeah, which, like, I identify with today's right wing extremists as well as actual, like, identified fascists of the past. So, for example, the Nazis would have the figure of the Jewish Bolshevist terrorist, and like, if someone wasn't actually Jewish, but they were Bolshevist, then it meant that they're still a Jewish Bolshevist terrorist because their Bolshevism has kind of made them Jewish and made them a terrorist, and also if they were Jewish and they weren't a Bolshevist or a terrorist, it would still be that they were basically Bolshevist and basically terrorist. So it kind of creates this sense that you can extend even to like kids. You can say that they are like basically incipient versions of this thing. And we can see we saw the same sort of thinking in Vietnam, where um, uh, William Kelly explained killing women by saying he thought that they basically had a million little communists in their bellies ready to come out. And we see very much that same sort of thinking about Palestinian children, very common among Israelis at the moment, that they are just larval terrorists, which is unfortunately the stakes we're dealing with is people who kill children. Anyway, so people will use coded language, but I don't think that means that we should try and police it. Well, the only answer really is to understand it, and I don't think as well that we should try and censor people from expressing unpleasant views. And we can't control whether they're platformed by various people or not. We can keep them out of the mainstream, but they will find ways to reach people. So, one of the things about the attempt to suppress David Icke was that, lots more people, they cancelled his radio interviews and so forth, and lots more people turned up to his talks because, if he's saying they're trying to suppress what I'm saying and they are suppressing him, it kind of validates what he's saying. I also think the famous Holocaust denier, David Irving, in large extent, I don't know what lay in his heart originally, but from the outside, his blatant Holocaust denial came after his persecution. And it kind of makes sense that, like, if he is wondering whether there's a giant conspiracy to rewrite history, and then someone comes and locks him in a prison for his speech, it is actually going to validate his view that they are trying to cover something up. So I'm not really in favor of trying to shut people down. And there's a very interesting incident that I read about recently. I came across it first because someone was sharing a time when neo-Nazis were allowed to speak publicly more, and there was a bit of an upsurge of Nazism in Oregon. There was a group which had 20 whole members, so but they had a very public profile, and one of them spoke at a gathering and said that we need to build a wall on our southern border, and everyone, of course, topped by barbed wire, and everyone burst into laughter at the insane Nazi, which I think is good. I think it was good to let him speak there, and then everyone laughs at him. And then the same guy also spoke at Reed College in Oregon, and this guy, Jewish guy called Mark Loeb, made sure that everyone listened to what he had to say. Right? He said to them that it was very important for them to hear what he had to say, and then they did have a good laugh at what he had to say. And then at when they went to the question section, he said, "Now I want you to ask serious questions. We don't want any of this gotcha stuff or any 'have you stopped beating your wife yet' type questions," because he really believed that people should see what the Nazis think. And I wonder um, what happened to that ethos. I feel there's a desperately anti-democratic idea that we can't let the masses hear things that might persuade them, and it's like this is not working. You're driving people underground, and in this day and age of social media, underground doesn't mean you're not reaching millions and millions of people. You know, it just creates a sanitized corporate wishy-washy world of um, of censorship, while they are just doing an end run round it and finding the damaged people that they need to fill their ranks, and we are not taking them on and tackling their ideas. And one of the um, sources about this was an article about this meeting that with these Nazis was an article written in 2017 by someone who's speaking with great nostalgia about this time when the Nazis. It was another Jewish guy. He turned up to it with a yarmulke to put on, and Mark Loeb told him, "Oh, you don't need that because no one's going to think you're a Nazi." Because there were no people there buying what the Nazis were selling. You know, they were there to see what they had to say, not to believe them. I think that's a distinction that people don't get nowadays. So this was a great time for that guy. He viewed it very fondly, and Mark Loeb had since died, and he spoke praise for him for being that person who said, "No, listen to what the Nazis have to say." And yeah, we need more of that. Instead, we drive them into a not very underground, where they're thriving, and use this sense that some things cannot be spoken, this sense that we need to police people's speech to attack people by accusing them of anti-Semitism. Now, some people will be aware that the British Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, was had a long process of an anti-Semitism crisis, and I need to put this in context straight away. In that, like, a lot of people pointed at the Tories and said, "Why are you talking about Labour's anti-Semitism but never talking about the Islamophobia in the Tory party?" Well, it was not not the most useful reaction, because the reality is that um, surveys of the attitudes of members of both parties show that there are more anti-Semitic beliefs amongst Tories than there are amongst Labour Party people. And anyone who actually uses their brain and thinks a little bit about the politics of uh, each party would not be at all surprised by that. You know, the um, traditionally The right wing have been the people who embrace racism, and the left wing are the people who are against racism. And traditionally, and I know it's hard to tell these days, I really do, but the Conservatives are to the right of Labour and attract people of a more right wing bent. So it should surprise no one that they had more anti Semitic members than Labour. But this process, this long, agonising process, happened in the Labour Party instead. It's well documented in the book Weaponising Anti-Semitism by Asa Winstanley, which is based on his work that he wrote in the Electronic Intifada. You can also there's other things like there's an Al Jazeera 4-part Al Jazeera documentary about I can't even remember the name of it. But basically about the functioning of the Israel lobby in the UK, and it deals with that as well, that issue, and their machinations. And of course, the central figure in this is Jeremy Corbyn, who was accused of anti-Semitism on false grounds on multiple occasions, and unfortunately chose to try and placate those people when he probably shouldn't have. And the one of the things they accused him of, for example, was laying a wreath um, at the graves of Palestinian terrorists when he was in a delegation of MPs that included Conservative MPs, and he was in a different country that was 2,000 kilometres away from the burial place of the people who he was accused of celebrating. Another is, of course, the famous mural that he liked on Facebook. Now, when I first saw it, being conscious of this problem with caricature, I thought that the muralist had, maybe without intention, replicated Jewish caricature stereotypes. So he has a bunch of figures. I think two of them are Jewish. They're all historical figures of people who have wealth and finance and financiers with power. They're sitting around a monopoly table, which is on the backs of suffering workers, symbolically. Now, my thing was originally that I thought there was, like I could see hook nose and all this sort of thing when I looked at the names of the people, who they were. Then I went back a couple of years later. I looked at it, not remembering who was who, and I could not tell you which ones were meant to be Jewish and which ones weren't. So I kind of realized it really maybe isn't even sort of third degree unintentional anti-Semitism. It wasn't anti-Semitic at all. And of course, the other thing that people use, a kind of rather ridiculous thing that they claim that proves it's anti-Semitic, was that it had the pyramid and the eye symbol associated with Freemasonry and the Illuminati and conspiracy theories, which have been linked to Jews. That's true. But the thing is this: the monopoly table is piles of money on it. It's coloured in the same scheme as the traditional greenback in the US, and that symbol is on the old US old US money. So it's very clear to see the link and why that was put there. It has nothing to do with any Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. So this was used to attack Jeremy Corbyn, and of course, part of this was because of his support for Palestinian rights, but I think we cannot forget as well that the military hated him. He was considered a danger to the defence establishment in the UK, and the military-industrial complex was a big part of the uh, force behind wanting to remove Jeremy Corbyn from the equation. Now, while we're on the subject of the military-industrial complex, I want to mention that it was originally called the military-industrial congressional complex when Eisenhower first drafted the speech in which he coined the term. He was persuaded not to use the congressional part. But the reason I bring this up is because of the Israel lobby thesis about the invasion of Iraq. Now, contrary to a lot of people, I believe this is an anti-Semitic theory. It should probably shock some of the people watching this, because it's not really what most people of my political bent believe, but I'll explain why. The reason is that the way the US system works is that the military-industrial congressional complex is a method of controlling the houses of Congress in the US, and part of it involves this distribution of the arms industry to various districts that becomes an economic factor within them, which can be used to ensure that people within those areas toe the line. The representatives of those areas remain loyal to the empire. And you have what is essentially an extremely undemocratic polity with a surface democratic system, but really it's something fought over by various elite interests at the very top, but within the framework of a pretty robust, almost monolithic imperialist elite that works in the permanent war system that was initiated in the late 40s and early 50s, that basically is a key part of the functioning of the United States of America. So the Israel lobby didn't just get the power it has for no reason. It is essentially an annex to this existing military-industrial congressional complex, in that it becomes another disciplinary method for controlling and obviously the growth of lobbying from various interests, and this strange corrupt system whereby instead of paying people directly, you fund them to campaign and so forth. So the way money is used to choose candidates and to also discipline them, so that you can say, as APAC has said to various people successfully, if you don't do what we say, we will make sure you don't get elected again. So it fits in with that system, and to say that it is outside of it, or unusual, or unique, or that it has power to do things that go against the other interests involved, I think is suggesting a basically is coming back to pretty old-fashioned ideas about Jewish control of people that exaggerate how much Israel can control the US. And the relationship between the US and Israel is that um, the US can cut them off whenever it wants. They, you know, Israel is totally dependent on the US, and this assumption that the tail wags the dog, it actually embeds a lot of assumptions about what US interests are, what the nature of the country is, um, and the leadership of the country are not, um, they're not beholden to the same values that the people of the US think their country represents, and they project upon their leaders the sort of things that they might want in the world and think that their leaders share those values. But the history, for example, of the millions of people they killed in Korea, the millions of people they killed in Indochina, the over 1 million people they killed in Iraq. Of course, this is the point in contention, of course, but the genocide in Guatemala, the brutality in Chile, Argentina, and El Salvador, Colombia, the Contras in Nicaragua, all of this, none of it says that going into Iraq and creating chaos, destroying the economy, and killing over 1 million civilians is different for the US, or that there needs to be some explanation that the Israel lobby made them do it. And yet this seems to be very attractive to people, and it's anti-Semitic. That's all I'm going to say. It just is. I can't keep going on about this forever, but another time maybe I can return to it. Anyway, so there is a move afoot as well to going back to the weaponization of anti-Semitism rather than me accusing other people of being anti-Semitic. Going back to that, there this has been going on for a long time. I should mention that Norman Finkelstein has been writing about this for a very long time. And his book, The Holocaust Industry, is available for free online. Anyway, so one of the major steps in weaponizing anti-Semitism, as Asa Winstanley's book is called, is the use of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, or the IHRA definition, which is increasingly, although there's some pushback now, is increasingly being formally adopted by various people. So the statement on anti-Semitism, what it reads, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. That may be a certain perception which may be expressed. Right? Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So what you have basically there is a very broad, totally, you could open that up logically to just about anything, really. May be expressed as hatred towards Jews. It isn't a definition. In other words, it's a bunch of verbiage that gives you different ways of interpreting things. And then they give 11 examples of anti-Semitism, of which 7 feature criticism of the Israeli government. So this is an extremely problematic definition of anti-Semitism. Overly elaborate, but also non-specific, and then with a prejudicial focus on the Israeli government. And some of the examples they give I don't think that a rational person could justify calling them anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism, I think, needs to be seen has to be looked at in context with reasoning, not using some knee-jerk reaction of you said the bad word and therefore you were anti-Semitic. And yeah, who knows what is happening at the moment in some ways. Is it that anti-Semitic feelings that were already incipient are just coming out of the woodwork? Is it that Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people causes anti-Semitism? Is it that our increasingly fascist politics suit anti-Semitism? That scapegoating, that witch hunting, that anti-intellectualism is abroad at the moment. And what's more traditional than applying that to Jewish people? I don't know. At the moment, maybe we need to be more concerned about the misuse of accusations of anti-Semitism, because there is a genocide happening now. But that doesn't mean that we should not pay very strict attention to what's going on with this, with some of the more loathsome creatures crawling out of the online sewers. Anyway, so just want to end there, and then just quickly mention some of the books I brought up. So there was Constantine's Sword, which was by James Carroll. Now, this is quite a long book, but I do recommend it. It does, the first 100 pages or so have a bit of theological material before it becomes more grounded in history, and also some very interesting stuff, biographical stuff about James Carroll and his upbringing as a person who spent a lot of time at the Pentagon and met the Pope and saw so-called relics and all sorts of interesting stuff. So it's a fascinating book. He also wrote a book called House of War about the Pentagon. Very good as well. Asa Winstanley's Weaponizing Anti-Semitism. Now, a lot of people might be familiar with his work from Electronic Intifada. For people who don't know about what went on with Chernobyl, Jeremy Corbyn, it is an important story, and it's well worth reading. The Murder of William of Norwich is again it takes William of Norwich's murder as a launch pad for something bigger, although in bulk it is about that, but it extends the scope into something bigger. A very interesting book. Shlomo Zahn's The Invention of the Jewish People is awesome. Very, like someone who doesn't like simplistic um, putting people into tiny boxes sort of thing. Someone who celebrates diversity and complexity, um, and thus is probably not so inclined to enjoy nationalistic politics so much. And Norman Finkelstein, um, two books that he wrote, I mentioned The Holocaust Industry, available online for free. This almost, could almost be nostalgic reading about this because it was written back in a time where the stakes weren't as high in some ways, even though, of course, it was always used to prop up the Zionist project and cover for, the Holocaust has been used as a cover for um, the crimes committed against Palestinian people from the beginning. But in a way, I think what he's talking about there is almost a foundation for where we're at now. And then he also wrote Beyond Chutzpah in response to Alan Dershowitz's The Case for Israel. And that is, that is the classic Norman Finkelstein work, as far as I'm concerned. He calls himself a forensic writer, and that's him doing that at his best. So I recommend that too. I've got one more thing. It covers back to front, but I can't really describe this yet because I haven't read it. It's called Zionism During the Holocaust: Weaponization of Memory in the Service of the State and Nation. This is by Tony Greenstein, and I only got it the other day, so looking forward to that one. But I saw him interviewed by Rania Khalek, and I am happy to recommend it without even having read it. Put it that way, because it looks like an awesome book. And yeah, so with those little book recommendations, I will say goodbye to you and thank you for your patience in getting through all this quite long talk. And I hope that it helps. And just, I guess I could just say, Free Palestine.